I would put to you that they are not silly shorthand things that were ill thought through or should have relied on Mr Obama sticking to the distributed speech. That's a very curious feature of Australian politics. What they are is very well thought through, conclusive ideas which say something quite specific and reveal a very firmly held belief on the part of the maker of the statements. And I think that they're worth some kind of analysis of what it is the message that they're trying to sell, and indeed the message I think that the progenitor of the statements actually believes in. I think it's this. I think that they are sending an unequivocal message, notably that the solution to outstanding problems long associated with the human condition, such as the production of cheap and clean energy, the provision of cheap universal health care, are near within reach by the combination of two things. Firstly, the reform and refinement of liberal governance systems, combined secondly and very importantly with an apparently irreversible advancement in science and technology. Now, it is interesting to me that after the calamities of the 20th century, that the faith in political action is so alive and well in modern liberal democratic politics. And I want to just go through some of those ideas under this first banner of science and technology. Now, some utopian projects have relied solely on political action to achieve their ideal ends. So in More's Utopia, you had the great ruler Utopus, who 900 years earlier than the writing of the book had simply laid down the perfect rules to govern the perfect society. Plato's Republic, again, it assumed a society which would value knowledge, but it didn't assume ever increasing amounts of material wealth that you could endlessly redistribute amongst its citizens. It just set down the rules for a perfect society. Thinkers like William Morris in his book News from Nowhere, who wanted an idyllic craft-based socialist system, he positively forswore science and technology and set out the rules in which you could have a perfect society with a very limited bundle of goods. Now, I would argue that liberal theory and intellectual history has traditionally taken a relatively modest view about the increment that can come to the human condition and human institutions by virtue of science and technology. That, I consider, has now been supplanted by something which is getting close to a branch of liberalism which believes firmly in a very, very considerable, if not exponential, increase in material wealth for government to distribute into the future. Now that has in turn, I think, been spawned by a range of economic analysis which in my view are shallow. I'll just give you a couple of examples here. The weightless economy. And in fact, the London School of Economics has got a lot to answer for, and a Mr. Quah, Danny Quah from the London School of Economics, who came up with the term weightless economy, which is meant to refer to information, intellectual property, advertising, education, biotechnology. He said international trade becomes not a matter of shipping wine and textiles from one country to the next, but about bouncing bits off satellites. Another curious one is the factor 4 theory. A bunch of economists who have said that we will be fine into the future and indeed have incredibly radical increases in human prosperity because we will be able to quadruple increases in resource efficiency using existing methodologies whilst avoiding negative impacts on the overall quality of life. Now, I'm not here to state economic criticisms of those theories, although I do believe that there are very strong ones to be made. I mean, if I just take one moment to say this, with respect to the idea of the weightless economy, I don't deny that there is significant economic growth to be had and that will be had into the future by virtue of goods which are not hard goods. But the idea that that can somehow translate to an endless ability to spin off natural resources so that governments have ever-increasing, exponentially increasing amounts of material wealth to distribute, I think is nonsense. And if you live in Western Australia, you're prone to think of that as nonsense, I think. We are told in Western Australia very regularly that China is building 2 coal-fired power stations every single week. When you look at that statement, it's actually very hard to source, interestingly, although it seems to me to be possibly correct, and it came from a UK Home Office report. Australia is forecast to export 394 million tonnes of iron ore in 2010. 97% of it is mined in Western Australia, right here, and 60% of that total export goes to China. That is not weightless. I mean, natural resources and scarcity are something that have always been with us, and I would imagine are going to be part of the human condition for a long time to come. The idea of merely finding better ways to distribute a fixed pool of wealth is not a very popular intellectual project amongst modern Liberal Democrats of the centre-right and centre-left. There is a growing assumption that what you will be distributing is a radically and exponentially growing pool of material wealth. And to me, it bears remarkable resemblance to the Marxist project, the practical Marxists who tried to bring heaven on earth in the 20th century. Now, in the paper that I've written, I go into some detail about some of the comparison between Maoist communism and Stalinist communism, but let me simply say here that obviously Marxism was about a complete and thoroughgoing reorganisation of the economic and social institutions of society. And for all of us who've read all the books, it is fascinating how closely people like Stalin adhered to the blueprint. I mean, it is amazing to think now that you would have command and control economic mechanisms and a centralised administrative structure, monopolistic control over the surplus. The surplus that was generated would be redistributed according to some committee's views. Some of it was kept for Treasury. It was quite remarkable. But what is absolutely fundamental to the Marxist projects of the 20th century was that they did not rely on political action alone to bring about their utopia. They absolutely and thoroughly believed that science and technology was, if you like, the catalyst or the key that in combination with their political restructuring of society would bring about a cornucopia, which could be endlessly redistributed. There is a wonderful book by a fellow called Gabriel Satayanda, which compares Maoist communism and Stalin's communism and looks at the obsessive way in which they wanted to replicate what they saw as Western technology at the time, because that was the key that would allow them to succeed in building a communist utopia. Indeed, he documents a saying that was in the left of the Maoist Communist Party, which was that you should not pull the cart without watching the road. And that was meant to be a criticism of the Dengian type view that you must replicate Western technology. Pulling the cart without watching the road was this assumption amongst the far left of the Maoists that if you took the technology over, you might create the very inequalities that your political action was trying to wash away. But in any event, the point that I'm seeking to make is that when you look at the history of 20th century communism and its utopian experiments, they fundamentally relied upon and assumed that massive increments in human wealth would be the result of what was then, for them, very novel and new technologies. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of a moment now looking at just some common sense ideas that relate to this concept about exponential growth in material human wealth. Let's imagine for a moment that organisational structures remain substantially as they are in Western liberal democracies. And let's just imagine for a moment that there is a continuing growth in knowledge, science and technology. Will there be enough wealth to distribute by virtue of the growth in science to eradicate poverty, ill health, crime, hunger, all of the parts of the human condition that have plagued us for so long? My answer is no. Ceteris paribus, what we see in the growth in science and technology will not translate to a cornucopian amount of material wealth to redistribute. And that is for a couple of reasons, I would posit. The first is something to do with the very nature of scientific growth and growth in knowledge itself. The second is an important point that technological growth is contextual. It relies heavily, perhaps not exclusively, but very heavily upon political action and systems to see it translate into human benefit. And I'll come to that in a moment, but I might just stop here and just look at scientific knowledge itself and the growth in it which we've seen. And of course, you're familiar with the idea that genetically modified crops, that more productive agricultural techniques will eradicate hunger, perpetual economic growth can be expected to increase to such significant levels that overall poverty will reduce, that we will remove entirely the incidence of poverty somehow, that medical science and technology will become so readily available, so advanced and so cheap and so widely available that we will not have ill health in the way that we have seen previously. Leaving aside the ability for political action, I'm sceptical about those types of thoughts growing up in liberal democracies for a couple of reasons. First of all, the idea of scarcity, the golden law of economics, that competition is conducted amongst scarce resources, does not seem to me to be likely to be a rule broken, even in the immense increase of scientific and technical knowledge that we're now experiencing.